Welcome to the Building Things with Machine Learning podcast. I'm Yao Shan Ho. In every episode, I interview people who are building really interesting products using machine learning. And this week, I'm super excited to have Ciro Greco join. Ciro has built some amazing things on personalization and lots of other features, particularly in e-commerce. Ciro, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Awesome. I'm so happy to have you here. Tell us some about some of the applications and features that you've built that relate to your e-commerce background, and then maybe I'll pick one and we can dive into it.
Yes, definitely. So, well, I come from a natural language processing background, and I've been an entrepreneur, founding my own company that was doing information retrieval and natural language processing back in 2017. That was called Tuso AI. And basically, the idea was to apply NLP to use cases that were useful for e-commerce. The value prop was at the time to provide some capabilities could bridge the gap between the experience that is offered by very big data players like Amazon, eBay, Etsy, and so on, and the rest of the market, which is kind of a large and broad characterization, but then our clients ended up being like mid to large retailers and brands who don't necessarily have the same DNA, tech DNA, the same expertise, but also they do not have the same amount of data. And so there were like at the time many things that could have been, you can big data your way out of certain problems, and it also means that you have certain needs and certain strategies work well for you, and that doesn't necessarily translate to the kind of clients that we're talking to and we were helping. And then that company, so that was 2017, so it was before Hugging Face, so NLP was still hard. Then there was in 2019 we joined Coveo, as a company got acquired by a much larger company that also has a history in information retrieval. Coveo has been a search company and a leader in search as a service for quite a while. They were like getting more and more serious about the e-commerce, and so we, as the Tuso team, would join to lead, partially that and help with artificial intelligence and machine learning specifically, as that was my background. So in the last 3 years, I've been VP of AI at Coveo, and I ended up working on, a large number of things, like some very foundational about how you create a structure and processes that support ML efforts, and others more specifically on e-commerce tech.
And then others more e-commerce. Well, let's focus on maybe a feature that we can kind of talk about and learn about some of the experiences you've had. I think we talked about personalization as one area. Can you help us just describe, as an end user going to one of Coveo's customers or Tuso's customers, how would my experience be different based on some of the features that you were developing?
Right. So personalization has been a big deal for us because, for e-commerce is generally speaking a big deal. And the idea is that you try to, tailor the experience of user that just goes on in e-commerce websites and browse around for shopping. And by the experience, we mean basically the components that a company such as Coveo takes over. So in this case, the search engine, the query suggestion part, and of course the recommendations. So that was like more like the part. There's also category listing, which is more of a kind of a specific e-commerce thing. So it's just like the order in which you list the items in a category page. But so the idea was, well, we need somehow to help retailers to make the whole experience more personalized around the user. So that was like kind of the end goal from a very general point of view. Now, that means, though, that especially in B2C, that translates into a number of problems that are not necessarily obvious, and some constraints are kind of unmovable. So one of the things that we had to face is just a fact. It is most of our clients didn't really have many users that they could identify directly. So most of users do not log in an e-commerce website. They don't have a profile, right? And honestly, they don't come back very often. I mean, there are like exceptions, like if of course, like if you're a grocery store, it's a different story. But let's say, one of our biggest clients is a very large player in the do-it-yourself space, and unless you're like really an aficionado in that, you don't come very often
Yeah.
on that website. So the point is like, how can we personalize the experience without going through the idea that we can basically, learn about this person because we see this person very often and we know exactly who this person is and we know when this person comes back and so on and so forth. And so we used like a number of ideas from machine learning to kind of hack this problem. And that was like a feature that was very interesting for us because uh, well, besides making like the whole, it was a pretty cool feature because like it makes sense to have like a personalized experience that changes with the browsing experience without necessarily being too hooked up on who you are in the profile.
Mhm. Mhm.
But also, it kind of like, to me at least, as and when I joined Caveo, it was also like the first moment when I had to really think about what are the components that are needed in a company that was like much larger than my own, the one that I founded. What are the components that are needed to support this kind of effort and make this happen, at scale? Because, Coveo can have like 1,000 models in production at any given moment in time, so it's not, it's not Google, but it's not that
There's some
small, right?
infrastructure problems to solve there. Yeah. Yeah.
Practices, infrastructure, it's a number of things, like, but yes. So, and like, and we still consider, I think, like, there's a long thread that me and my co-founder, the my co-founder and I, like, evangelized for quite a while. We still consider a company such as Coveo a reasonable scale company, like, as opposed to a big data company. And a lot of what we worked on is also machine learning ops, data ops. So how do we engineer something like that? How do you make sure that people can actually deploy and use stuff in production at a scale that is not trivial, but honestly is not Amazon? So,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's a somewhere in between, like, it works on my laptop and Amazon.
Well, let's talk about that because you've kind of talked about how the problem is unique because you don't have Amazon's data, but you're also talking about how you're not just a laptop. You can't just solve things with a laptop because you're approaching the scale of Amazon. But let's talk about the first thing there first. I hadn't thought about it, but I think you mentioned that when you're at Amazon, you have so much first party data about every user and everybody's logged in that you can kind of like big data your way through a lot of problems. And then for a lot of the customers that you were serving where they don't have
Yeah.
that first party data, you kind of have to kind of infer it through these ML techniques. Can you talk about that experience a little bit more? Because I think that's actually fascinating and far more applicable to most people because there's only one Amazon out there, obviously, and a lot more
That
mid-sized
is
retailers.
that is very true, and that's the reason why we evangelize so much about like the reasonable scale, because like we feel that there are like so many reasonable scale companies out there that have like these. We're a bit quirky because like we're a B2B company, so you kind of have this thing that you have like tons of models in production all the time. Some of them are complicated, some of them are not, but the point is that there's many of them,
Mm-hmm.
which is, I guess, like slightly different from what the majority of people who use machine learning in production are, because that just for because that's a statistical distribution of companies. Most of them are B2C, so you might end up having like one model in production. But anyway, the point is that uh, not only the things that you should do are quite different, but also your incentives are very different. Because like if you're Amazon and you can make your recommender system more accurate by 0 point something, well, that still translates into millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, just because just it's just a sheer fact
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
scale, right? But that doesn't make sense for me, as I am a provider for reasonable scale
Reasonable scale.
companies themselves. I am a reasonable scale company that works for reasonable scale companies. So reliability is more important for me, and replicability is more important for me. And I don't necessarily have, for instance, to invest tons of work in modeling. On the other hand, like for instance, the marginal gain in making your data right, your data ingestion, the practices around the data, how you organize the teams around the data, how you transform the data, how you build a infrastructure for machine learning that is not cumbersome, that is not a monolith, that helps, developers also, because another consequence of being a reasonable scale company is that you have a finite amount of resources.
Right.
Google literally prints money. So if they want to hire, you know, 20 new data scientists, that ain't a problem.
That's right. That's right.
But for a regular company, like it might be. So you also want to make sure that you have an attractive way to work, like a developer experience that is very pleasant, so you don't lose your people, because that can hurt your team. So being a reasonable skill company is kind of like, it has a lot of ramifications in the way you should build stuff. We
Well, my co-founder comes from Google, where he told me to train a model, he would just allocate 1,000 TPUs and just run a job overnight. And I'm like, what reasonable scale company, is going to have the resources to just, fire up 1,000 TPUs with no regard for.
No, exactly. But also, like, like it doesn't. So for us, it was really like, at the end of the day, kind of it boiled down to a number of things that we learned, and they were like, I don't know, like to a certain extent, there's somewhat like obvious if you think about it, but we kind of had to learn that ourselves, like the hard way. But like the first one was that data is always superior to modeling for us, 100%. Like you can have like fairly complex models, and the personalization based on session data that we worked on sometimes had things like that were like reasonably complicated, but not open AI complicated. You know what I'm saying? Like it's just like, all right, so it's hard, but not that hard. But the point is that the data, like standardizing our data ingestion, for instance, standardizing the whole pipeline that from ingestion transforms the data and ensures replicability and replayability was much more valuable than having like, 10 people working on modeling. The other thing that we learned is that replayability and replicability are very important. So basically, the gospel of the modern data stack really fits the bill for us. So it's like log and then transform. Don't touch data. Always make sure that there's somewhere a place where you have like raw data sitting there, and you can transform. And if you don't like what you did, you can just like kind of time machine your way back to the raw data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I grew up in ETL. I know the world is now ELT. I'm totally with you. It also aligns with, a trend that we believe in as well of data centric AI. So I love your line. Data is more important than modeling.
Yeah, but because like, like part of that is just like a function of the fact that the research, this is what, for instance, like we ended up publishing and having a quite strong presence in top tier conferences like, NeurIPS, KDD, and ACL and so on. But especially in the e-commerce tech, it was always kind of weird because it was, Flipkart, Amazon, and then us. So much of the research and so much of what people talk about come rightfully from these companies that have constraints that are somewhat different from everybody else. So there's so many people that have different needs, but the only thing that they can Google upon is a paper that is built by someone at Amazon or Alibaba, and that person did this research or published this piece having in mind a very different set of incentives as constraints.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Awesome. Tell me about where one of your ML techniques might be different based on your data availability being a reasonable scale company rather than an Amazon. Let's maybe just take personalization as an example. What are some of the tricks that you had to work a little harder at to invent
Right.
to kind of get the same kind of experience that somebody would expect from an Amazon, but your customer doesn't have all the first party data that Amazon has?
Definitely. So that specific problem for us meant that, and I guess like now is more widespread. And like when we started working on that, it was a while ago, and so it was there weren't many things around. But so the idea was, we don't have the first party data. We don't have a profile about this user that is gonna consistently build up throughout time. But we do have other data. We do have session data, and we do have catalog data. The catalog we have because we're a search company, so that is literally the piece of information that we index and we search on. And then we have we can put just like, a simple cookie and track what happens throughout the session. So the question was, can we use this data to do something that personalizes the experience? The idea was just to, in a kind of a loose metaphor with NLP, do a prot to vec as opposed to a word to vec. So sessions are, just sequences of page views at the end of the day. So you can embed those and create a multi-dimensional space where, all those sessions embedded together should represent fairly well how the website works and how the different products and pages of the websites are distributed. So if you have, I don't know, like a fashion e-commerce website, what you should expect is that all the sessions that contain, shoes will kind of like cluster in a
Mm-hmm.
certain area of the space, and they're like farther away from, pants than they are from boots and things like that, right? So you can start, like, once you have that vector space created, then that becomes like kind of a unsupervised representation of the website that you can have, and then you can use that to power a number of downstream tasks that are actually what we sell. So the recommender system. So maybe what you want is to use this vector space as in an information retrieval context to just like re-rank candidates for a recommender system, or rank candidates, or apply a certain weight of re-ranking on the search engine and so on. But the main idea was, with the data that we have, we can create a reasonable understanding of what the website is. And it was also very important that all these things can play well with, again, the unmovable constraints of our business. Because, like, more than the algorithm and more than whatever you want to do as a machine learning practitioner, is really the unmovable stuff that is important. It's really the constraints that are outside of whatever of your power, that shape what you need to do. So this was a good idea because, well, it's all anonymized, so no GDPR involved. No, we don't have to worry too much about, privacy and security. Web pages are pretty much the same all the time, so the same data integration can be done with a few lines of JavaScript in the website can be done for literally every website that I serve. So there were like a number of constraints about our scalability, and we try to, engineer our solution around those.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you end up, like, we didn't want to get into the point, and sometimes, I've seen that happening throughout my career, where you have like something that is very cool, but then, you go, oh, bringing this to production is going to be too costly, or it's just like the other teams might not be on board. It takes too much to integrate. How do we communicate these integration practices to a number of partners that integrate our product? So the devil is in the detail
Yeah.
there,
Yeah.
and you have an awesome paper, and then
I
it kind
actually
of
want
like,
to dig into that since, I think our audience wants to learn all of the pain that goes into building ML related products. But I'll just say that I've heard of word to vec, I've heard of embeddings, I've heard of feature extractors. I've never heard of session to vec. And so that's going to be one of the takeaways I
oh,
have from
okay.
this conversation.
Yeah,
That is
yeah, no, it's
so cool.
definitely a thing. It's definitely a
That's so
thing.
cool.
It works very well.
Awesome. Let's talk about some of those not so academic parts of getting the product together. You've talked about GDPR, something you could avoid, but I'm sure there are other legal constraints and data pipelines. Can you talk about some of that dirty work that people have to do to kind of get to the point to actually put together fancy features?
Well, in our case, so in my experience, what the data part is very important in terms of so the it's very important to understand that, first of all, there's a cultural change sometimes that needs to happen, and no tool and no technique will really buy your way out of that. The cultural change needs to happen implementing practices, and sometimes it's slower than you uh, would like it to be. But part of that is, first of all, uh, the data integration needs to be a first class citizen of your product. And this is not necessarily true, especially in B2B, right? Because sometimes product integrations are carried out by professional services or partners, and the client does not necessarily understand why certain requirements is so important. So the first thing that I found myself doing, for instance, was explaining um, literally to us, to salespeople, you need to let people, business stakeholders know that this piece is super important, because I do not want this conversation to be the last thing that we talk about when we have to schedule the integration. And it is just an IT problem. I want somebody who writes a number on a check to know that if this is not done properly, and you bought our product because there are some machine learning features that you think bring value, if this initial piece is not done properly, well, this is going to make everything else much
Mm-hmm.
harder, and
Mm-hmm.
possibly you will not see ROI. You know, and this like took a while, because now we have like people that never heard of this, our sales reps that need to understand why they have to bring up this kind of weirdly technical point in a conversation that is about ROI,
Right.
right?
Right.
Legals is a big deal because like legislations change very fast. And also, again, I came from a company where I could design everything, and I designed legal strategies for a company that was a data company. So Tuso was 100% a data company. So I took more responsibility in being secure and in being, but I own the data, and we could do that. The data that we collected are open sourced, and we open sourced them, for instance, in the when we hosted the SIGIR data challenge on e-commerce. It's, to my knowledge, the largest data set available of real world sessions in e-commerce out there. But when you have like a company is larger than that, well, maybe this is ideal, but it's not what you're going to find. Maybe there are like other reasons that are more related to a risk assessment mind frame where, it would be nice, but we also have a different line of business, and that different line of business now deals with healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't really afford to be
Yeah.
that loose in that.
The
And
brand.
so designing a, you know, because it ends up being a little bit dappled sometimes. You have like then a use case that is different from others. Like as e-commerce, people are not particularly worried about that. But then, if you're doing like a search engine for, an enterprise search engine for a financial service company, like conversation might be only about security and legals, right? So you kind of need to find a way where things are like differentiated enough to ensure that we don't have to go through the same constraints altogether, because otherwise, like, if I have to build an e-commerce product around the same constraints that I have building, a healthcare, that's just nonsensical. But on the other hand, technical people sometimes tend to underestimate how important these things are, and how long and annoying a discussion with a lawyer can be. So sometimes you kind of need someone who speaks like a little bit of both of legalese and technicalese, and
Well,
so
Chiro, I
that
think
was part of
what
what
I'm
I did.
taking away from this conversation is how hard it is to realize value from ML techniques. It's not just the algorithm. It's not just the data. It's also cultural shifts in your sales process. It's your legal constraints. It really is like any other big deal, which ML is. It's going to touch on lots of different parts of the company.
Monitoring, testing, like the fact that like you put it online, yay, big cigar, high five, and then in a month from now, it's like, how is that going? It's like, we don't really know. Well, that is not good. So
Right, right, right.
yeah.
Well, let me shift gears a little bit. I think our audience would just like to learn, how did you personally get into ML? What's your journey been?
My journey, I'm not, it's quite unconventional, I think, but so I, uh, I hold a PhD in neuroscience. So back in the days, I was working mostly on formal linguistics and ways to formalize, linguistic competence in kids mostly. So how a human being acquires a language, knowing that um, you know languages are very different one from another superficially, but at the end of the day, every human being will learn a language naturally, and it doesn't matter where the kid is. Like you can, take a kid and just like raise him in Japan, he's going to learn Japanese. If you raise him in Turkey, he's going to learn Turkish and so on. So this is a long-standing problem in a long-standing debate, in kind of like nature versus nurture problem. And so I was working in that area. And then I was really convinced that I would have been like a college professor. But then it turned out not to be the case, like big time. So it wasn't for me. It was just like too specialized, too slow. And so I started working with Jacopo and Mattia, my co-founders, and we were really in the beginning, like trying to apply some of the things that we were working on as cognitive scientists. Again, like this was a time when natural language processing, when it wasn't clear that natural language processing was something that deep learning would have affected so much. We were still unclear whether we could have, got the same amazing results that we had, for instance, in image recognition. Now it turns out to be the case. We know like GPT-3, and when transformers came along, the whole thing changed. But at the time, it was very controversial. So we tried to work on that. And then Mattia was a digital consultant, was working for Accenture, and he was actually going through digital transformation. He was working for digital transformation for big clients, and he was saying like, look, like there's a problem with search engines because literally no search engine makes sense. Everybody keeps asking stuff just like, well, but if Google can do it, why can't we? Just like, well, I don't even know where to begin to answer that. But the bottom line is that we can't. So there was a real opportunity there. And so we started a company like that around this opportunity.
Was that
Moved to San
Tuso?
Francisco. Yeah, that was too. So yeah.
That was Tuso.
So I ended up being in machine learning through the foundation of my company as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, incredible, incredible. I would usually ask people advice they have, but I feel like you've already given so much of it. As a VP of AI, your problems span so much more than building models. It's about data. It's about dealing with all the lawyers and thinking about how to manage sales. So I feel like in some way you've already answered that question. But are there any other tips that you have for people that maybe are in the middle of their career and seeking to get to your level as VP of AI type roles?
But I'm not sure because like I'm always skeptical about giving advices to other people because I don't really know much. But one thing that at least was true for me is that, so right, there's a progressive commoditization of capabilities that when we started, like it wasn't that long ago, but just like think of what a data scientist was in 2015, right?
Mm-hmm.
A data scientist in 2015 was a guy with a PhD in something that transitions from academia to machine learning, and very few tools were around. So the having done a PhD was also somehow a way to make sure that this person was able to figure out a complex problem on his own, and that was how things were done. Now, if you compare with what happens now, you have so many amazing tools right now to make your life better, and I salute that as absolute progress. So your job is going to be more about understanding what the product does and how your machine learning component, unless you work for a machine learning company, like unless you work for OpenAI, like whose only purpose is literally build machine learning product. But if your machine learning product is 90% of the times it's just a component of a product, it's really understanding the context in which this thing operates, this piece, this cog operates, that makes like more effective. Like my favorite data scientist is not necessarily a person that is like super great at natural language processing or super great at modeling, but it's definitely somebody that can be, paratrooped into a customer call and get something meaningful out of it, and understands, like talk to a client, try to understand his needs, and work his way to the product backwards.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And I'm so with you on the power of the tools. I mean, in my own 20-year career, you see tools that are just incredibly powerful compared to what they were. And it allows one developer to be able to do more. As you do more, you get to
Oh
look
yeah.
higher and higher and more strategic and more impact to people rather than trying to solve algorithmic
Yeah,
problems.
to a certain extent, like your job becomes like being able to put together all these different tools becomes as valuable as coding your model from scratch, which is not a thing that people do anymore.
Right.
It's
Nobody
just
can.
like nobody does that. No.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, Chiro, I want to thank you for just an incredible conversation about what you've
Thank
done,
you.
as well as some of the practical learnings that you bring that I think our audience is really going to enjoy. Thanks, everybody, for checking out this podcast with Chiro. And if you enjoy this podcast, please give us a rating on Apple iTunes or Google Podcasts or Spotify. It helps others find our podcast. Until then, goodbye.
Bye.